All right, everyone. Well, I hope you had a nice week off and kind of back to it now. Kind of maybe the strangest fall break of all time. Only 2 weeks of school before then, and I've got to say that I'm particularly happy that you can't see me during a live lecture here today. I had to shave my beard over break. I was um, removing asbestos from my basement ceiling tiles, and so in order to get the seal on my mask, so I didn't breathe that stuff in, I had to shave my beard for the first time in 17 years. So my skin is in complete rebellion. Um, but that is neither here nor there. Let's talk today a little bit about the creation of our Constitution. A little bit more storytelling. This is far and away the most historical of all chapters that we study. Probably the only bit of history, really, other than Supreme Court cases later. But we have to lay the groundwork of how we got to the Constitution. So the first question we're going to look at here is, why did the Articles of Confederation fail? And so, rewinding a little bit, I gave you an assignment before break where we were kind of looking at the Articles of Confederation and really kind of tapping into what you remember from last year in a push or U.S. history. And hopefully, you remember that after the Revolutionary War sort of wrapped up, we moved on to this new um, era in American history before the Constitution, before our first president, where we were governed by a weak Articles of Confederation. And so we looked at a lot of the weaknesses last week, but the ones that really stick out first and foremost is that the Articles of Confederation were terrible for the economic well-being of our new nation, right? In particularly, we saw at the Articles of Confederation that it was these United States of America, not the United States of America. And in the Articles of Confederation, states were sovereign. States had significant independent powers. Amongst them, each state was empowered to deal with financial issues on their own, right? They would print their own currency with different weights. It would be, say, that, this is a dollar of the state of Maryland and the dollar of the state of Pennsylvania. And, some states were economically worse off, so their money was worth less. And so we basically had a system where it was almost like the European Union, where individual countries are sovereign. In this case, it's states. And to deal with this issue of weak economies in certain states, we saw the age-old problem of some idiot that never paid attention in history class of what do you do when your money's not worth anything and you don't have enough of it? Well, by golly, let's print some more. And those of you who remember my pictures and going back to my lecture for World War II, one of the precursors to World War II was Germany's terrible economic well-being, where they printed money to the extent that money was worth more burning it to heat furnaces than it was to actually buy anything. More money equals less valuable. And so some states just started printing money, and we got to a place where the new economy of the United States, these United States, wasn't strong enough to function. Right, we were barely treading water and trying to deal with our debts from the Revolutionary War. And in addition to the terrible economic status of the United States at this time, we also had basically a national government that was set up in the after period of the Revolutionary War, where there was legitimate fear of creating a national government that was too strong. And so, your first question that we're really going to look at here, I want you to kind of um, answer on your page, is what was it that was sort of shaping the mindsets of colonists, or not colonists, I guess, at this point, but citizens of the United States? What was their mindset? What were they thinking about? What were they afraid of for why they would set up a new government where states were largely empowered on their own and the national government was extremely weak? Pause your lecture here and answer that question. You answered that question in your page by saying that they were really kind of thinking hard on King George and their relationship with England prior to the Revolutionary War. then you were in a good place, right? They were extremely concerned about setting up a national government that was going to be overly strong and that they were going to find themselves right back in a situation where they're going to be governed by a new King George that was going to do the same abuses of power that that sent them to revolution. So they purposely created a national government that was extremely weak, gave the power to the states, where the national government was essentially having to beg and borrow. They couldn't even borrow, beg essentially in order to deal with problems. And so one of the historical events that really drove how weak they were home was something called Shays Rebellion. And in a normal, United States or a functioning modern nation, the story of Shays Rebellion would be a quick afterthought and barely even register, right? Because Shays Rebellion um, was essentially a rebellion of farmers armed with pitchforks and some old rifles left over from the French and Indian War. And these farmers, sort of fed up with poor economic conditions, basically seized the county courthouse outside of Boston, Massachusetts, of this little small town led by a man named Daniel Shays, who was a farmer himself. And so their farms were being foreclosed on because they weren't making enough money to pay their debts, and the dollars were so worthless that the farmers got together and organized sort of a pitchfork rebellion. And so again, while this is really embarrassing to the new United States, essentially the state of Massachusetts was too weak to deal with them. Right? They asked the federal government to send troops, and the federal government says, "I'm sorry, we don't have a national army here." And so they would ask other states, "Can you send troops to help out your friends in Massachusetts?" And the other states said no. And so Congress of the United States of America found themselves unable to actually raise an army to stop what was essentially a podunk rebellion by a bunch of like old farmers who had fought in the Revolutionary War, were probably in their 50s and 60s, were poorly armed and poorly outfitted, but wreaked havoc in the Massachusetts countryside to the extent that no one was able to stop them. And so this inability to stop what everybody sort of knew was a ragtag bunch of farmers and bring order back to this new United States, this inability to do that was embarrassing. And it really drove home exactly how weak the United States was. And so what we ended up seeing was that the elites of Massachusetts, right, the rich landowners, ended up having to raise private armies by paying their own money in order to stop Daniel Shays and his ragtag group of farmers. And so basically, given, and there was other problems too, and you saw that in last week's assignment, but the economic turmoil, the sort of chaos that was the banking system of the early United States, and how poor our dollar was worth, and the fact that the national government was just extremely weak and couldn't respond to even basic disruptions really spelled need for change. And so how did the national government respond to the Articles of Confederation failures? Well, essentially, they set a meeting. And the meeting is famously known as the Annapolis meeting because it was held in the city of Annapolis, outside of Baltimore, sort of not too far from Washington, D.C., which didn't even really exist at this time yet. But the city of Annapolis was going to be a meeting spot where the national government called for representatives from states to meet in Annapolis in 1786 in order to discuss what everyone saw were real and critical problems, dealing with state commercial conflicts where certain states were taxing other states, um, imports, and certain states were trying to borrow money from foreign countries, and certain states, their dollars were worth significantly more than other states. And so this was creating a ton of conflict between the states. And this meeting, which was otherwise pretty irrelevant and didn't really accomplish anything, the significance of the Annapolis meeting was in the sense that because only 5 states showed up and they had these critical errors, and only 5 states even came because they didn't believe that anything worthwhile was going to get done there, that basically the failure of the Annapolis meeting prompted the national government and representatives from the states to basically get everyone's assurances to meet 1 year later. And so another meeting of the states was called for a year later in 1787 with the express goal of revising the Articles of Confederation. And I want to be clear here that the original verbiage here of the Annapolis meeting, where they got the other states to agree to show up a year later, was to revise the Articles of Confederation, to try to fix the problems that was so hamstringing, the United States. And so the meeting that came a year later in 1787 was super significant. And this ended up being the Constitutional Convention in the city of Philadelphia, my hometown, in Independence Hall, and so again, Annapolis meeting, not that significant, except that its failure prompted the calling of the Constitutional Convention. So what was the Philadelphia Convention that came a year later in 1787? And so this time, 1787, a year later, with a bunch of like fanfare and begging by the national government and a lot of behind the scenes work by important future founding fathers, delegates from all states showed up except Rhode Island. But Rhode Island's so small, nobody even noticed. And so the 12 states, their total delegates added up to 55. And these became known as the founding fathers, or the grandfathers or godfathers of America. And so these 55 delegates showed up, and they got there in 1787 on the kind of a late spring. I think they met in May. And they immediately basically realized that revising the Articles of Confederation was not going to be possible. And that instead of revising the Articles of Confederation, what we really needed to do was start over, right? And basically what began being drafted under lock and key, right, with their windows shut because they didn't want anyone to know about it, because they knew that certain states would freak out if we were going to create a new U.S. Constitution. But, with the windows closed in the middle of a Philadelphian summer where everyone was dressed in their wool coats and their wigs, they sweated it out together for many months to begin writing the United States Constitution. And as you can imagine, the creation of the Constitution was formed not just with the failures of the Articles of Confederation in mind, and not just with the fear of King George and British tyranny fresh on their memories, but really what guided a lot of the weeks and months of discussions here was basically a debate on the nature of what was to be Republican government. And I don't mean Republican in the modern sense of Republicans and Democrats, but I mean Republican in the truest sense of that word. And so Republican government is essentially a type of government where the power rests with the voters, right? A republic, right? Where we elect people to lead and speak on our behalf, and we get to make choices. And so this debate on what was the nature of Republican government took a long time, right? And brought a lot of strong feelings of people who held different ideas on what should be the nature. And this gets us back to the kind of that first week of class, or the first couple days of class, where I was introducing you to Locke, John Locke. Locke loves little people. And Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes hates human nature. Locke loves little people. Hobbes hates human nature, right? And these people that I began our year with, their ideas really kind of guided a lot of the debates and the arguments here, right? As these godfathers of America sweating it out together in this Independence Hall, Philadelphia, were basically balancing the ideas of Hobbes, who called for a strong central government in order to keep the brutish, nasty people from destroying themselves, along with the faith of natural law and natural rights of Locke, right? Where people give up their rights for a government to kind of support them. So freedom should rest with them. So this was a debate, right? And so your second question that I really want you to kind of answer here is, go ahead and summarize the basic arguments of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And if you need to go back into your old submitted assignments or your notes to do this, great. And I'll go ahead and wrap up part one and give you a new link for the second part of today's lecture.